Hey y'all, welcome to my Kamisato Ayaka guide as of Genshin Impact 4.3. The Shirasagi Himegimi is back once more. Ayaka still remains one of the best DPS characters in her role as a freeze carry 2 years after her release. In this guide, I'll go over everything you need to know about her. Without further delay, let's jump into it. Talents first. Ayaka's normal attack on its own is pretty inconsequential, but there's another mechanic she has that ties back into it, so let's go through that first. Her alternate dash, Kamisato Art Senho. Ayaka is currently one of 2 characters that have an alternate dash. When you go to input a dash, Ayaka will cloak herself in a frozen fog that will drain stamina when you move. This can also be used to traverse across water in the overworld. When you exit her dash, Ayaka will pop up and apply cryo to the surrounding area, including enemies nearby. At the same time, she will also infuse her sword, causing her normal charged and plunging attacks to do cryo damage. This dash does have some other effects that are in her other passives, but we'll get into those in a bit. Back to her normal attacks. Now knowing that her normal and charged attacks are imbued with cryo, this talent makes up a small chunk of Ayaka's entire playstyle. It should mostly be used when you need to fill some downtime for her burst or any other cooldowns to be online again. There are some combos you can use to maximize the efficiency on those, but I'll get into those in a later section of the video. For now, her elemental skill. Ayaka's elemental skill, Kamisato Art Hyoka, briefly summons a circle of cryo around her and does damage based on her attack stat. Pretty simple, just a wide hit of cryo. Well, that's not everything. It generates a lot of particles, so it's good for Ayaka since she's burst dependent. Ayaka's elemental burst, Kamisato Art Sometsu, makes up most of her damage and staying power. On cast, Ayaka will unleash a swirling blizzard that goes in a straight line in front of her, dealing 19 cuts of cryo damage and an explosion at the end of it that all scale off her attack stat. This ability is one of the highest total scaling in the game, with about 4,000% at level 10. Also, this ability snapshots. This means her burst calculates its damage from the stats Ayaka has when she casts it, and will not change over the duration. Ayaka's A1 passive gives a 30% damage buff to her normal and charged attacks for 6 seconds after she uses her skill. It sounds like a nice buff, but you're usually using her skill into her burst for good energy funneling. So all in all, you don't really make full use of this buff most of the time, but it's still a really good damage bump whenever it is used. Ayaka's 4th Ascension passive gives her alternate dash a couple of extra effects. When she exits the dash and hits an enemy with it, she will regenerate 10 stamina points. Assuming that you are just sprint spamming, this basically means that she can do it pretty close to forever. Not only that, but she will gain an 18% cryo damage bonus as well, boosting all of her damage. Very nice buff because it also nicely ties into the infusion effect. And those are Ayaka's talents. Not much to explain since it's all pretty simple at a baseline. With that said, which talent should you prioritize your books on first? For Ayaka, if you haven't caught on already, you want to level up her burst first as it makes up the majority of her value. Next will be her normal attack talent, and last but not least will be her skill. As I say that, you should level up all of her talents anyway since all of them add a substantial amount to her total damage. Alright, so you've got a better idea of how Ayaka operates. So how should you build her to perfection? Let's talk about the build, starting with the artifacts. Ayaka's main, best, and only team archetype is Freeze, meaning that, for better or for worse, she really only wants one specific artifact set, that being the 4-piece set of Blizzard Strayer. Since the only team you should be playing her in is Freeze, the 4-piece set bonus is not hard to trigger at all. The 2-set bonus gives 15% cryo damage bonus, but the 4-piece effect gives 20% crit rate if you're attacking an enemy affected by cryo, or 40% if you're attacking an enemy that's frozen. Crazy buffs for Ayaka overall, to the point of forcing it even if the pieces are bad, since that is a lot of free crit rate. And because it's a lot of free crit rate, and even more that I'll talk about in the team comp section, this lets you prioritize other important substats on the actual pieces. Along the way to farming a 4-piece of Blizzard Strayer, you can offer any mix of attack percent, cryo damage, or burst damage sets that, yes, will do less damage because you'll need crit rate in your substats, but they'll work alright in the meantime. Now, what stats are you actually looking for? Let's go through the main stats first. For her sands, Ayaka wants attack percent, since she mainly scales off of it. On her goblet, Ayaka wants cryo damage bonus. She does cryo damage. Okay, yeah, you get the point. Okay, here's where there is some variance. For her circlet, Ayaka can prefer a different one based on what characters you're using with her or her weapon. In most cases though, she will want a crit damage circlet. Since you're already getting a 40% crit rate boost from the 4-set of Blizzard, among whatever straight rolls or other effects you're getting, you should be able to use a crit damage circlet by the end end of it. On the other hand, if you have a lot of damage percent buffs already, like take for example, if she was holding the Mist Splitter Reforged, an attack percent circlet may be better to not reach diminishing returns on the abundance of damage percent that she'd be getting. Although, if you have Shenhe, a crit damage circlet is almost always, if not always, better due to how her buffs work. In terms of her substat focus, you want to prioritize ER until you have enough to use her burst every rotation, as it is the majority of her damage. On the note of ER, Ayaka's ER requirement range can be big, but also really forgiving. Around 140% is good as a general number to aim for. Can be more than you need, but if you don't have certain character or weapon combos, it's a safe number to have. If you have her on the Amanoma Kageuchi, which I'll talk more about in the weapon section, her ER requirement can be drastically lowered to only needing about 100% to 130%, depending on the rest of your team. Second is crit damage, third is attack percent, and crit rate is last, since you'll still want about 30 to 40% or so before all the external buffs. So now you've got Ayaka's artifacts, but what about her choice of weapon? Ayaka has a decent number of weapons that are good for her, but with it comes an odd situation. Because she'll get a bunch of crit rate from Blizzard's Trader, weapons with slight or secondary stat are generally less valued over some others that might offer more utility. There is the off case where your Hydro character might not be that fast at applying the elements, so crit rate weapons will be better, but you're mainly looking for attack percent or crit damage based weapons most of the time. That said, let's go through your options. First up is the Black Cliff Longsword. I mean, if you like bigger crit numbers on your stat page, sure, but you need to defeat enemies to trigger the passive, so all in all, not a very good weapon on top of having to spend Stardust on it that you could spend on Constellations instead. Gonna go a bit out of order here, but next up is the Battle Pass's Black Sword. The effect on it only works on a smaller part of her moveset, so it's pretty much only a crit rate stat stick with some occasional healing, which is already unnecessary as it is. Still, if no one else is using it, it's not bad. Next is the Inazuma craftable, Amenoma Kageuchi. Its base attack is on the lower end for a 4-star, but the attack percent and secondary stat makes up for it. The real draw of this weapon is its effect. Up to once every 5 seconds, if the wielder uses an elemental skill, the weapon will gain a succession seed, up to 3 seeds max. After casting an elemental burst, the wielder will regenerate flat energy based on how many succession seeds the weapon has. What this means is that Ayaka's ER requirement is cut by a significant amount, especially with refinements, to the point of barely needing any in her substats at all. This is one of Ayaka's best 4-star weapon picks, being able to fill in most if not all of her ER needs while still giving attack percent for her damage. The last recommendation I'll make for the 4-star category is her new best free-to-play option, the Fontaine Craftable Finale of the Deep. Now, note with this weapon is that you do need a good healer and some ER following some of the thresholds I mentioned earlier, but if you can fulfill those conditions, this weapon will net you the highest potential damage of all the 4-star weapons. After using an elemental skill, the wielder gains a buff to their attack and a bond of life. Once it is healed off, the wielder gets a flat attack buff based on the HP that Life Bond took up, basically meaning the more max HP the wielder has, the more effective this buff is. And this buff is pretty strong, getting even stronger with refines, up to the point of rivaling some of the 5-star options. Speaking of which, let's get into those. First up in this category is the Aquila Favonia. Not the best of weapons, but it's got a high base attack stat and some extra attack percent in the effect. In the same vein, there's the Summit Shaper. Big attack stats and more upon landing hits on enemies, although you need a shield to be able to maximize its effect. But there is practically little to no point in running a shielder for free since enemies shouldn't be able to attack you in the first place. So the most you'll ever need is a good healer. Scoured Blade's ER secondary stat can basically make up all of your ER requirements with some to spare. The effect is too small to matter, so besides the ER, the only other thing it has is a base attack higher than the 4-stars. Now, for the crit swords. Light Foliar Incision, Splendor of Tranquil Waters, and Primordial Jade Cutter all have large crit secondary stats, but their effects offer little to nothing to help Ayaka besides that. Still decent options purely for the crits. Haran Gappak Futsu is actually pretty good despite its crit rate stat. Since its stat is lower, the base attack on it is higher, making it more valuable to Ayaka. Besides that, it gives an all-elemental damage bonus, helping every relevant part of Ayaka's moveset, but as for the normal attack damage bonus, not so much. If you have it without having an Ayato to go along with it for some reason, it's really good on Ayaka. I've saved the best for last, and here it is. The Mist Splitter Reforged. The highest base attack on a sword to date, matching Aquila's, with a crit damage secondary stat to boot. Gives a 12% all elemental damage bonus on the passive, akin to Haran, but unlike Haran, Mist Splitter will give more depending on how many of its effects you trigger. Upon using an elemental normal attack, elemental burst, or having less than 100% energy, the wielder gains a stack of Mist Splitter's emblem. Fulfilling all 3 conditions at one time will net you 28% more elemental damage bonus bonus with a total of 40% from the whole weapon. Fantastic weapon for Ayaka since she can make full use of its effects. This is also the primary scenario where an attack percent circlet will do better than crit damage thanks to all the damage percent you're getting from the weapon. Last note on this is that you will have to change your combo with her if you want to maximize the buffs going into her burst. And those are good weapons for Ayaka. She is a little awkward compared to most other characters in her preferred weapons, but you've got a really accessible option in the Amenoma Kageuchi being free to obtain. With all of the building process out of the way, let's talk about her constellations and see if they are worthy of pulling to improve this Ice Princess. Ayaka's constellations are mostly very big, albeit very overkill power upgrades. Ayaka's C1 may as well just not exist. With this constellation, whenever her normal or charged attack does cryo damage to an enemy, they will have a 50% chance to lower her skill cooldown by 0.3 seconds. This is 0.3 seconds out of a 10-second skill cooldown, never minding that her normal and charged attacks are just time fillers to begin with. Trying to trigger this constellation will result in losing damage, and even if you get 1 or 2 hits that do trigger it, it doesn't change her rotations anyways. Ayaka's C2 is a potential early stopping point should you want to invest in her. When casting her burst, Ayaka will now spawn 2 more blizzards next to the main one that each do 20% of the original's damage. This can be a big upgrade for Ayaka as a whole. Just like the original, those 2 also go in a straight line, so this constellation's value will depend on the enemies you're fighting, as well as how many cuts of the blizzards you actually hit. Ayaka's C3 and 5 boost the talent levels on her burst and skill respectively, with the former being a significant buff to her primary source of damage. C4 is one of Ayaka's best constellations. Whatever enemies her burst hits will have their defense decreased by 30% for 6 seconds. This is one of the very few effects in the game that reduce the defense of enemies, and helps your team do more damage during those 6 seconds. Last but not least, Ayaka's C6. With this constellation, Ayaka will gain Usurahi Buto every 10 seconds, super buffing her next charged attack, increasing the base scaling by 298%. This becomes a constant effect on Ayaka, so you'll get this damage bonus every 10 seconds. It's a powerful constellation for sure, but one that maybe comes a little too late. To cap off on Ayaka's constellations, aside from C1 and C5, there are all substantial upgrades to Ayaka's personal damage, as well as being one of the rare occurrences of defense reduction with her C4. Her constellations don't change anything about how she works, and they only serve to improve what is already a complete character at C0. Though, if you do decide to invest in them, my suggested stopping point is at C2. We've gone through both how to build Ayaka and what she can get out of her constellations, so now let's go through her good teammates. Seeing as how Ayaka's main playstyle is freeze, let's go over the general team structure. Freeze teams generally follow a mold of 2 cryo characters, an Anemo, and finally a Hydro character. They're usually 2 cryo characters due in part to at least one big thing, that being the cryo resonance effect you gain if you have 2 or more cryo characters in the party. It gives another 15% crit rate buff whenever you're attacking enemies affected by cryo, which means that Ayaka can get 55% crit rate in total for free. Besides that, the second cryo character can lower Ayaka's energy requirements as well as adding in their own value, depending on the character you're using. That being said, let's begin with the second cryo slot. Ayaka's overall best cryo teammate is Shenhe, without a doubt. Shenhe is quite literally the cryo damage buffer designed to fit Ayaka. Her icy quills can add a lot to Ayaka's total damage output. However, due to how those icy quills only buff a specific number of hits, another character might be better for this slot if you're fighting against a lot of enemies at once. Of course, I say that, but you've got other options in Ganyu for more damage, Diona, Layla, or Charlotte for more sustainability, and Kaya or Rosaria for a good mix of damage and energy regeneration. An animal character is also typically used in Ayaka Freeze to group enemies as well as giving some damage support in the 4-piece set of Viridescent Venerer. The best pick for this slot is Kazuha. Gives comfy and reliable crowd control through his skill and elemental damage bonus depending on what you swirl with his A4 passive, all making him the premier pick for Freeze. Next are Venti and Sucrose. They're both behind Kazuha due in part to them not buffing anything having to do with Freeze. That can change with Sucrose's C6 effect, but for the most part they are still amazing for their ability to crowd control. For your Hydro slot, since you need one for freeze, Ayaka's options are really open here too. Kokomi will be one of the best options for her long-lasting AoE of Hydro Application and Healing, with some added attack buffing potential in Thrilling Tales and the 4-piece set of Tenacity. Furina will be another amazing choice if you want to run your healer in the Cryo slot instead. She gives a huge damage and healing bonus buff on top of periodic but long-lasting Hydro Application. Just another fantastic pick overall. If not those two, you also have the options of Mona for her Omen debuff, or Ayato for his widespread Hydro Application and filling in during cooldowns. You can also use Shincho or Yelan for more normal attack-based Hydro Application, each with their own benefits over the other, or Barbara as a budget Kokomi. And those are some great teammates for Ayaka. Before we get into a showcase, let's talk about tips to best optimize her rotations. Ayaka has a few nuances in her rotations that you should know to make her do more damage while also regenerating more energy back for her burst. First one being burst related. To get the most damage and energy back from more rotations, start by inputting a dash into an enemy to get the cryo damage bonus from her A4 passive into an elemental skill, then immediately use her burst so that she can catch the particles from her skill during the animation. If you're using Mist Split or Reforged on her, input a normal attack in between the dash and skill. This will maximize the buffs on the weapon by the time you go to use her burst. The second tip is the best normal charge attack combo to use during the team's downtime. Her best combo is an N2C, 2 normal attacks into a charged attack. This is more so meant to balance out the damage she's doing to the stamina she's consuming, and for this reason, that will be her best combo. That's Ayaka as a whole, but let's do a showcase to give you a better picture of how she performs. For this showcase, I'll be using Ayaka at level 90 with a level 90 Amenoma Kageuchi at Refinement rank 5, Triple Crown for her talents, C0 with 4-piece Blizzard Strayer. Here's the build. Let's show off the Shirasagi Himegimi. Roll the clips. Let's wrap this up. Ayaka has been the premier freeze carry since her release, having the advantage of a really comfy playstyle. Better yet, she's extremely easy to build considering the 40% crit rate you get from Blizzard alone. For more details, check out the KeqingMains Guide linked below the like button. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back for another video. See ya.